My name's Sandy Alexander. I'm a resident scholar here in Lowell House and a member of your senior common room. And it's my pleasure to introduce the second speaker tonight, a senior, Abiola Laniyonu.
Good evening, Lowell House. As Sandy said, my name is Abiola Laniyonu, and it is my great pleasure to address you this evening. I want to share with you my experience with death in Lowell House, my experience of losing and almost losing people close to me. In sophomore year, around finals period, I received a late-night phone call from a good friend. He was at home on break, and so we caught up on how finals had gone and our plans for our next vacation. And then, ever so casually, he began to describe how he had just tried to kill himself. He described how he was sitting alone by himself that night and how he didn't feel anything about anything. He described how, without really realizing what he was doing, he had wrapped a belt or something around his neck and pulled it tighter and tighter. He described that instant when he realized he was killing himself. And then, with nothing else to do, he had called me. And I remember that night. I remember feeling terrified and alone. And eventually, I called someone who called someone else who went to his house and made certain that he got the help that he needed to recover. The next morning, I thought there could be nothing worse than that sharp, nauseating pain and loss of control that had struck me cold immediately after I hung up the phone and began to wonder whether he would try to kill himself again that night. But I was wrong. The whole next week and the week after, the acts of being a student, of studying during reading period, of spending late nights in Lamont, and of planning for formal while wondering at the same time, day by day, had he hurt himself again? Had he been committed? Did that conversation actually happen, or was it just a terrible nightmare? Was often too much to bear. When people asked me how I was doing, I didn't think to mention, well, I'm struggling with the attempted suicide of a good friend, and I was involved in having him involuntarily committed to a mental ward where the doors lock from outside and the windows have bars like in prison. And also, I need to study for an exam that I'm totally unprepared for because this past week I've been seeing people's lips move, but all I can hear is his voice describing that belt around his neck. It was much easier to say, I'm okay. Weeks later, I was walking in the basement of Lowell when a mutual friend called and told me that he knew and that he was sorry. He was sorry that it happened, yes, but he was so sorry that I had been dealing with it alone. It wasn't until that phone call that I realized how desperately I had wanted to know that someone else knew. Not so that we could discuss it in detail, but so I could tell him, I'm okay. And he would know that I actually wasn't. That I'm okay actually meant that I was struggling and that I was overwhelmed and that I needed him to be there for me. This past fall, as many of you know, our classmate, Cody Laramie, took his own life. Cody, Frank, and I spent many nights last summer hanging around Winthrop House, working as research assistants. And once again, when I found out he had died, I felt that nauseating panic and loss of control. But this time there was a difference. So many of us from Prize or from the Glee Club or from around campus knew Cody and loved him that we could mourn together and support one another. The shared grief made the pain not hurt less, but easier to bear because we didn't have to pretend that we weren't hurting. And a dear friend who didn't know Cody, but who did know me, stayed up the whole night with me in silence because they knew that's what I needed. It was painful, but it was easier to bear together. So I want to thank you guys because I appreciate you being around. And I do mean all of you, because even if you haven't directly been there for me, even if you don't know me, you certainly have been around for someone, and you shouldn't underestimate the power of your presence. As Brett was drawing down his time as resident dean, he would say at tea or at other gatherings that he had shared the best of times with us and that he had shared the worst of times with us. And I think I understand what he meant, because for me, sometimes the best of times were the worst. I've never loved somebody as strongly as I did when I saw how hurt they were by a friend's loss. And I've never felt so hurt and so loved as when I faced the loss of a friend in the shared embrace of grief. So thank you for being here for me. Thank you.